Okay, today we're going to start chapter 4 on Mesopotamia. As we talked about last time, the first civilizations grew around river valleys, right? And they all roughly started around 3000 BC. So, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China are those four, and we're going to take one at a time. So, we'll start with Mesopotamia. As you can see, both Mesopotamia and Egypt are on this map. This is probably the oldest of the civilizations. It is in that eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, they call it. And Mesopotamia means Greek. In Greek means the land between two rivers, the rivers, of course, being the Tigris and the Euphrates. Okay. So it's called the Fertile Crescent because obviously the land is very fertile and it is in the shape of a crescent. So if you can see from Egypt going around to Mesopotamia, it looks kind of like a crescent moon, or I think it looks a little more like a crescent roll myself. But we're going to focus on that eastern part which is Mesopotamia. Okay, so Mesopotamia, of course, we talked about how they settled around rivers because rivers are going to be life, right? For water, for not only for drinking for yourself, but for the farming that they're going to develop, right? So people have been living in this area for a lot longer. Probably there's evidence from about 7000 BC that people hunted and lived there. But now, of course, then they started settling down, farming around 4000. And then it eventually gets to be this advanced, technically a civilization around 3000. Okay, so the problem they're having in this area is even though they're settling along the river, there can be periods where the river's really low. During the summer, especially, there's little or no rain, and the water can be really low. And so, of course, that's going to be difficult to water your crops, especially the farther away from the water they are. And then, of course, they have the opposite problem in the spring. It can rain a lot, and it will either rain or the melting snow from the mountains causes the rivers to overflow their banks. And although that is bad, there's overflowing, and of course it can kill crops and animals and destroy some homes. There is the positive effect that when the water recedes, the silt is left, which is really fertile soil. Okay. And so there is that positive that happens. So it ends up being really a good place to farm in the long run. Okay. So, what do they do to try to deal with these problems? Well, they build irrigation, right? They have dams or levees. Levees are like building up the walls along the riverbanks much higher so that it can kind of contain the water. So try to prevent it from overflowing and going and destroying things you don't want. It also, you can see here is someone's illustration of they built canals to bring the water out to places they do want the water to go. Okay. So irrigation is going to be a big thing that helps Mesopotamia grow into that civilization. Okay. Of course, then, because they are so successful in dealing with this and farming, they have surpluses. And remember, we talked about when there's a surplus, that's going to encourage trade, and not everyone needs to be a farmer, and so they can specialize. Remember, we talked about being artisans, specializing in making the pottery or tools or whatever the people need. And that is going to encourage people to grow, move to places together that will favor this trade. And so we see cities develop. And as cities eventually grow, then we finally get into that advanced, what we call a civilization. Okay, so we're going to talk about Sumer, which is one of the regions in Mesopotamia that had several of these large cities. It's in southern Mesopotamia. Okay, so here's Sumer, you can see highlighted, and the people are called Sumerians. All right, and there are three major cities: Ur, Uruk, and Eridu. Okay, and those are cities that develop independently of each other. They are surrounded by mud flaps and really hot desert, and it can be very difficult to travel between the different cities, and so communication is cut off. And so they they make their own goods, they make their own government, they really kind of keep to themselves quite a bit as far as what they need. Okay, and so that begins to develop something called city states. Right, that city is now controlling the land around it, and they start governing that land around it too. Okay, and so these city states got to be quite large. There are about 5,000 to 20,000 ish people who would live in them, and for protection, they built large city walls around the whole city. They don't have a lot of wood, right, to build things in this area, or even a lot of stone. So they use sun dried bricks, and to make the bricks a little more sturdy, they incorporate reeds within the bricks. Okay, and so they even have a gate that they'll close at night to keep it completely enclosed. All right, and then in the city, usually the setup is very similar. In the center of the city, you will see usually the palace of the ruler, and we'll talk about that in a second, and a large temple, because we know that religion is very important to them. They are polytheistic, and so they believe in many gods, and they believe that gods are controlling their life. They can control the weather and things like that, but they also control maybe what people do, right? And if you pray to the right gods, they will help your plowing go better and your brick making and things like that. Okay, everyone worshipped a lot of gods, but usually every city-state picked one main god to honor as their like kind of token god. And the religious building was a ziggurat. It is somewhat pyramid shaped. And at the very top, there's this temple. That small temple at the top was actually, they thought, the home of the god that they built this for, and that they thought the god lived there, and only the highest priests could go in there. But the ziggurat had many functions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. All right, a ziggurat actually means to rise high. And imagine this is quite the feat for building at this point in history, right? Early on, they think that the leaders were probably either religious leaders, the priests, or also who the stronger in military, right, who could lead them by force. And so then eventually over time, those leaders got to be, as we talked about before, someone who passed it down to their son. So then we call it a monarchy, right? And they started to think that their power came from the gods, right? Since they attributed all positive things to the gods. If someone is a good leader, then they must have gotten that from the gods' blessing, right? Okay. All right. Social classes. So that goes hand in hand with what we were just saying. The social classes are somewhat pyramidal. That saying that the upper is based on whoever has the power, right? So the kings, the priests, the warriors, even high government officials. And then there's kind of a middle class with the merchants, artisans, farmers, fishermen, things like that. And then there's a lower class of slaves, criminals, or debtors. People who can't pay their debts were forced to work to pay them off. Okay, and so you have it's clearly based on your hierarchy of power, right? And the majority, though, would be in the middle class. So actually, to say it's a pyramid is probably not really accurate, right? If the majority are farming in some way. They also were skilled metal workers here in Mesopotamia. And even though that's true, they still had to get their supplies from far away, right? They need metal. There's a lot of stones they like to make jewelry. There's one called carnelian that we know that they got that from India, from the Indus Valley. And lapis lazuli is a blue stone they used for jewelry, and it was from Afghanistan. And iron and silver they got from Turkey. So we know, well, today we call it Turkey. So we know that they did trade with faraway places. Okay. All right. The biggest thing that Sumer is known for is their writing. Okay. The writing system they developed is called cuneiform, and cuneiform is it is not writing like an alphabet like you normally think of. There's about 1,200 characters, and the characters represent different things, objects, numbers, names of things. And they would make it with a reed, and they would cut the reed so it would have kind of a wedge shape, kind of triangular, okay? And so they would lay the wedge shape down in certain ways, and that would make the symbols, okay? Not very many people could actually write. That is a skill, and usually only the wealthy boys could afford to get the years of training to be. And if you were particularly good at it, you might become a scribe, a highly sought after job where you would do all the important record keeping, right? They need all the business transactions, the count of how many people live in the society and how many animals there are, and marriage and things like that. So it was a very important job, but not very many people could do it. The other thing, writing ends up happening important was because eventually they want to record their stories. For centuries, they've been they've been telling their stories just orally, and now they can actually record them in writing. There is a very famous story that is written during this time period called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as far as we know, it is the oldest story that we have at this point. And I'm sure you know from language arts that epics are long poems, super long, that tell the story of a hero. So Gilgamesh was not a real person. It's a story usually telling lessons and things like that. Okay. Technology is another major thing that the Sumerians are known for. They had a lot of inventions that we can thank them for the wheel. And then, of course, as they have a wheel, they can go on and make different things that, first it was carts that they could pull things with donkeys. And then, of course, later that can be applied to a military use with chariots. The other thing is they would the first that we know of, at least, sailboats, so they could use the rivers for trade. The other thing is this is a plow, so they could the animals would help them pull the plow, and they can more easily get their fields ready. And then we have another use of the wheel is a potter's wheel, right, going the other direction, and that will help them with their making of pottery. And then we know that they, of course, we talked about this before, made bronze. So we believe the Sumerians were the first ones to successfully make bronze. And we talked about how, remember, bronze is made from copper and tin, and it is much stronger, so that will be helpful for tools. All right, the other thing that they're well known for is their mathematics, okay? They use geometry, first use of geometry that we know of, that they use to plan out the size of their fields and to plan out their buildings. That would be very important also, since they have to deal with the flooding and things, to plan things out. They had a place value system, very interesting. It's based on 60. So think about that. Remember, our place value works that when we decided to group 10 things together, and then for every 10 we move it up from the ones column over to the tens column, right? And now we have 110, or one group of 10. Well, for place value of 60, they would group 60 things together, and then they would move it over and say 1 in the tens column. So I have a video I'll show you. It's interesting why they picked 60, and it makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay, and then again, they're very doing a lot with math, so they want to make it division and multiplication are going to be very important to them to be able to apply your math, right? Understanding how to make a third of that size of that field or things. So they had multiplication tables, we know, and division tables. They also were big into astronomy. They would watch the position of the stars and they recorded it and they figured out when things would recur. And so they were able to decide when the time to plant was, or a lot of their religious ceremonies were based on having them at the same time of the year. Also, there was a 12-month calendar, similar to what we have, right? And they based that on the cycles of the moon. And you'll also notice that there is a lot of 60 in their math, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees. So I have a video here to explain a little bit about their math.
So the number we're talking about now is 60. Now, it's quite a big number, so you may not meet it all the time, but you do use it a lot when telling the time. It's of course like 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. But why 60? Why this random number 60? Well, it all goes back to the Babylonians. Thank you, Babylonians. Because what they wanted back then is a very nice number that divides quite easily. So if you think about the number 60, what divides it cleanly? 1, of course, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In fact, it's the smallest number that's divisible by all of these. Well, why is this important? Because you can take half of it, you can take a quarter of it, you can take a fifth of it, you can take a third of it. You can divide 60 up in a lot of ways. So if you're cooking in this base, you can cook with lots of fractions of that. So if you don't want to cook a whole meal, you can cook half a meal, or a third of a meal, or things like that. But again, if you're telling time, you can have a quarter of an hour, you can have 20 minutes, you can have half an hour, you can have 3/4 of an hour. It all divides 60 very nicely. And when you don't have computers, you need a number that you can divide nicely, so you get nice round numbers at the end of it, so because they're easier to work with. So in 60, well, why, if 60 is so nice, why do we use 10?
You just asked my next question. Go on, tell me why.
Well, the idea is that we use 10 because we have 10 fingers, so you can just count along. As you're a child, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, what's it's thought is that the Babylonians actually counted into 60 on 2 hands. They would use each knuckle on one hand to count 12, and then count the number of 12s on the other. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, one set of 12. And then you do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 2 sets of 12. And again, until you get 5 sets of 12, which is 60. Highly divisible, and you can use it on your hands. So when the Babylonians were working with this number 60, they were also very good astronomers. And what they found is that the year is pretty much 360 days. So that's the length of time it takes for the Earth to go a full circle. And that's why the circle is divided up into 360 degrees. And further, each degree is then divided up into 60 minutes. You can have an arc minute, which is a 60th of a degree. And that further is then 60 seconds, 60 arc seconds of that 60 minutes.
I wonder if we came close to living in a world where 60 became our base.
Like I say, it's very, very difficult. I mean, you could write, well, there's 57. We use it 2 numbers. For a Babylonian to write 57, they would have to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a lot easier to write like that than that. So these are how they drew their numbers, because they had little stylus that they would hit into clay. And the stylus had a triangular end. So the stylus would look something like that. And so when they were doing ones, they'd use the tip and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 10. And the 10 would turn the stylus on the side and create one of those shapes. So each one of these is 10, each one of these is a 1. And so there we have 57.